Section 17 of Gertrude Bell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lynette Caulkins. Gertrude Bell by Ronald Bodley and Lorna Hearst. Chapter 17. Sir Henry Dobbs, who succeeded Sir Percy Cox as High Commissioner, had been councillor at Government House for over a year. He knew the country and its problems, and had been a colleague of Sir Percy during the war. Most of his previous official service had been in India. Sir Henry and Gertrude knew each other well and held each other in high esteem. It was, nevertheless, a change of regime, and although Gertrude felt that she could never completely divorce herself from the country which she had made her home, she did not want to cling to a post merely because she had held it for some time. Her actual task in the making of Iraq into a kingdom was finished, but her advice and assistance in handling the Arabs could still be of great value, and physically she did not suggest her years. Marguerite Harrison, writing in the New York Times, said of Gertrude, "When I was first in Baghdad in 1923, I had the privilege of seeing Gertrude Bell on many occasions. The first time that I met her was by appointment at her office. After waiting for a few moments, I was ushered into a small room with a high ceiling and long French windows facing the river. It was the untidiest room I have ever seen, chairs, tables, and sofas being littered with documents, maps, pamphlets, and papers. At a desk piled high with documents that had overflowed onto the carpet sat a slender woman in a smart frock of knitted silk. As she rose, I noticed that her figure was still willowy and graceful. Her delicate oval face, with its firm mouth and chin, and steel blue eyes, and with its aureole of soft gray hair, was the face of a grande dame. There was nothing of the weather-beaten, hardened explorer in her looks or bearing. Paris frock, Mayfair manners. And this was the woman who had made shakes tremble at the thought of the Anglaise. Her smile was completely disarming, as was the gesture with which she swept all the papers from the sofa to the floor to make room for me. As it happened, everything worked out serenely for Gertrude. The High Commissioner asked her to stay on in Baghdad in an advisory capacity, and the king, in whom Lawrence had inspired a genuine interest in the study of antiquities, appointed her honorary director of archaeology, with a mission to create for Baghdad a fine museum. No one was better qualified for this task than Gertrude, who, even in the midst of the political turmoils, had kept up her interest in the ruins and excavations round Baghdad. Neither need Gertrude have had any worries as to Sir Henry Dobbs's appreciation of her abilities. In his first confidential report on the members of his staff, which he sent to the British government, he said about her, "It is difficult to write of Miss Bell's services both to the British and Iraq governments without seeming to exaggerate. Her remarkable knowledge of this country and its people, and her sympathy with them, enable her to penetrate into their minds, while her inextinguishable faith prevents her from being discouraged by what she sometimes finds there. Her long acquaintance with the tribes and sheikhs makes her advice in the recurring crisis in tribal affairs invaluable, and her vitality and width of culture make her house a focus for all that is worth having in both European and Arab society in Baghdad. She is, in fact, the connecting link between the British and Arab races, without which there would be dislocation both of public business and of private amenities." To Gertrude's satisfaction and relief, Sir Henry showed that he had every intention of carrying on Sir Percy Cox's policy of firmness with the discontents and propagandists. His first act was to move a mixed force of British and Iraqi troops to Mosul. That Mosul should be embodied in the mandatory area was of paramount importance. In addition to being a strategic point vital to Iraq in a military way, the Zagros mountain system in which it lay forming an impregnable protective zone to the whole of the Tigris and Euphrates valleys. It was commercially invaluable. It was a tremendous grain-growing center and a wool market, but above all, it held one of the richest oil fields of the world. Great Britain could not afford to let this oil fall into other hands, and the British delegation in Geneva was entirely in accord with Sir Henry Dobbs over the question of Mosul, which gave him a free hand in handling the problems in this part of the country. Often, when Gertrude was drawing up reports about the Mosul oil fields, her mind wandered back to those carefree days long ago, when, on her way to Tehran to stay with her uncle, she had been taken to see the naphtha springs near Batum, which were exploited at such a loss. Now, with the passage of barely 30 years, this oil, which had been made use of by the people of Nineveh 2,000 years before Christ, was important enough for Britain to risk the rekindling of war in the Near East. The mixed force dispatched by Sir Henry camped on the site of Nineveh on the opposite side of the Tigris to Mosul, and was joined by units of the Royal Air Force. Turkish irregulars, with the cooperation of the Sheikh Mahmud of Suleimania, were planning a Kurdish uprising. The Anglo-Iraqi troops, supported by the airplanes, advanced into enemy territory, and after 1 or 2 skirmishes and some effective bombing, the Sheikh fled, the Turkish troublemakers disappeared, and the Mosul border returned to tranquility. Sir Henry then turned his attention to the discontents in Baghdad. The underlying causes of trouble were, as usual, the Shia elders, who were doing all they could to make their influence felt in the elections of the new Constituent Assembly. The chief agitator was a certain Sheikh Mahdi al-Khalisi, a traditionally powerful leader throughout all districts where the Shia element predominated. Sir Henry knew that, until this man had been put out of the way, there would be no peace. At the same time, it would be an exceedingly delicate matter for a member of an infidel race to lay hands on a person of such reputed sanctity among Muslims. At Gertrude's suggestion, therefore, the king was approached and told that the unpleasant task must be his. Faisal at once understood, and the tiresome Sheikh Mahdi was deported by exclusive Arab agency. This deportation had the unexpected but gratifying effect of causing several other prominent Persian divines to leave the country as a public protest. Sir Henry waited until they were over the border, and then quickly forbade their return until after the elections. As a result of these decisive measures on the frontier and in Baghdad, the agitators realized that a change of High Commissioner had not altered the British policy in Iraq, and the political atmosphere cleared rapidly. By the end of the year, the enormous task of registering the electors had been completed. This was preceded by a reshuffling of the cabinet, the resignation of Abdul Muhsin Bey, and the appointment of Jafar Pasha as Prime Minister. Gertrude, seeing that all Sir Percy's projects were being carried through by his successor, allowed herself some relaxation. She continued giving her advice when it was required, and kept in touch with what was going on behind the scenes, but she could now find more time for less nerve-straining pursuits. Always devoted to horses and anything related to them, she felt that they might be the means of bringing the British and the Arabs closer together. The famous race meeting in those days of tension had shown how political differences could be forgotten when horses held the first place. So she suggested the formation of Arab polo teams, and found in the officers of the Inniskilling Fusiliers, now stationed in Baghdad, eager abettors in her scheme, and in the autumn of 1923 she inaugurated the first Arab-British polo match. The success of these matches was not entirely unqualified, for whereas the Arabs were superb horsemen, they had a certain difficulty in assimilating the rules, and could see no reason why a game should not go on indefinitely until one of the sides gave in from exhaustion. However, Polo did have the desired effect of bringing the Englishmen and the people of Iraq into the kind of relationship which would have been impossible otherwise. She took up mahjong, and found the Arab ministers much apter pupils at this game than at bridge, and in a short time her house was a gay centre of enthusiastic mahjong parties. One evening a British officer of the staff, with musical tastes, thought it might be a good idea to treat the Arabs to a sample of Occidental music. A piano was produced, around which was gathered a solemn audience of desert chiefs. The Englishman, equally solemn, sat before the piano and played the Sonata Pathétique. The last chords died away to the dignified silence of a polite people who have the same feelings about European music as Europeans have about Arab. But when Gertrude requested an opinion, the verdict was unanimous. Wallahi, koshdaga! By God, a good thumping. Lady Dobbs arrived towards the end of the year from England, and was given an enthusiastic reception, and social life at Government House soon became a feature in Baghdad. Gertrude was glad to have another woman with whom she could forget treaties and politics and Moslem problems. She had great ability for concealing the fact that she had the ablest brain in the Mandate organization, and could fit herself, when necessary, into the description of her in the New York Times: Paris frock and Mayfair manners. A strange woman whom the females treated as a female, and the males as a male or a female, according to the mood of the moment. One of the first official parties which Sir Henry Dobbs gave was to the King and his cabinet and the British heads of departments in the Mandatory organization. Gertrude received an invitation, but before accepting, she gave the matter a little thought, and then asked Sir Henry if he really wanted her to come. "Of course," replied Sir Henry, "if you won't feel smothered." Gertrude laughed, and said that, as a member of the High Commissioner's staff, she felt sexless, and would, therefore, attend the banquet. This she did, wearing a new evening dress, her diamond tiara, and all her orders and decorations. Sexless, but entirely feminine. Then, when the occasion arose, the gowns and the tiaras forgotten, she would go down the Tigris with the men, duck-shooting, dressed in breeches and a tweed coat. She seemed to have no age, and a mind which enjoyed everything it tackled. One night she would be dining with the king, advising him and discussing the intricate problems which faced him, and the next evening attending the performance of a traveling circus with the enthusiasm of a child. She rocked with laughter at the antics of the clowns, and even more so at the solemn faces of the Kurdish deputies who sat together in a box and never smiled throughout the whole entertainment. Then out to Kish or Babylon, excavating, collecting and classifying the finds for the museum, and contradicting eminent archaeologists from Europe and America. The mother of the Aga Khan, with whom Gertrude had had an amusing conversation years before in London, before her name had been famous in the Orient, paid her a visit. Gertrude found the old lady to be an amazing personality, who spent her time traveling about the vast domains of Asia, looking after her revered son's financial and religious interests, while he raced in England. In February of 1924, the first parliamentary elections took place. Few people believed that the Arabs, with centuries of tradition completely foreign to universal suffrage and government by the people, would ever be made to understand what this new form of administration meant. The voting was, however, carried out as if these desert people had never thought of appointing their rulers by any other method, and most of the right representatives were elected. There were ceremonies for the installation of the deputies, followed by banquets and garden parties, and the atmosphere of cordiality among all those concerned made Gertrude feel that, perhaps, after all, she had not worked entirely in vain. Her letters of this period give a feeling of lessening strain, and in the midst of comments on what the new government is doing, there are passages which indicate that most of the tension is over. "Send me out some mules, not for riding, for wearing on my feet," she wrote to Lady Bell. "You get them at the Galleries Lafayette in Regent Street. Black and gold brocade are what I would like. I have been swimming vigorously, and my bathing costume is wearing out and already has to be darned. Will you please get me another? The kind I like is in 2 pieces. I prefer silk tricotine, and I like best a square or V-shaped opening at the neck. As to color, it should show a general tendency to dark blue or green, if you understand me." Lady Bell was completely baffled by this last order. Since Gertrude's last visit to England, bathing suits were no longer made in 2 pieces or in tricotine, very few in dark blue or green. Lady Bell did her best, but the garment dispatched did not meet with her stepdaughter's complete approval. As if she had not already enough to do, Gertrude now started on some fresh and unofficial work. She was continually receiving inquiries from various parts of the world about the conditions in Iraq. Sometimes these queries were from an economic point of view, sometimes archaeological, often touristic. During Gertrude's earlier voyages in Persia and Asia Minor, she had found that the geographical works of Strabo, compiled a little before the beginning of the Christian era, were just as accurate as 20th century guidebooks. In many cases, Strabo went into greater details than Murray, and demonstrated that customs and ways of living had little changed in the Near East during the past 2,000 years. In her humorous way, Gertrude decided to compile a second edition of Strabo on Iraq, and started to write a comprehensive and accurate volume in entirely un-guidebooky style, which would supply travelers with all the historical and practical details which they might require. When she was not turning out pages of the guidebook, or acting as a kind of superintelligent officer and diplomatic interviewer for the High Commissioner, she was busy in the museum. The museum was finally taking shape, and, after inspecting it, the archaeologist Sir Frank Kenyon reported that he held the Iraq Department of Antiquities as a model for all departments of this kind. But even with all these occupations, Government House was always finding more things for Gertrude to do. A Labour government was in power in England, and was inclined to be opposed to the spending of British money in Iraq. A delegation of MPs was sent out to examine the situation on the spot, with Lord Thomson, the Secretary of State for the Air, at the head of the commission. Lord Thomson was an abrupt man, difficult to deal with, and his colleagues were all prepared to find fault. The visit of the commission was awaited with apprehension by the people at Government House, until Gertrude said that she would feel perfectly at ease with members of the Labour Party who only needed proper handling. Sir Henry Dobbs immediately decided to take Gertrude at her word, and she found herself put in charge of Lord Thomson and his companions. Gertrude treated them with her natural frankness, and showed them round as if they had been ordinary visitors. She took them to see the Baghdad notables and her Arab friends, and sent them back to London, convinced of the wisdom of maintaining the mandate of Iraq. This visit was followed by that of her half-sister Elsa and her husband Admiral Richmond, later knighted, who was at that time in command of the British East Indian squadron which had come up the Persian Gulf and was anchored at Basra. With them was their nephew George Trevelyan. Gertrude and Elsa, although separated in age by several years, had always been devoted to each other, and it gave Gertrude the greatest pleasure to entertain the little party from home and introduce her Arab friends. The visit was successful beyond all expectations, and a revelation to the Admiral and his staff. The officers of the Royal Navy are the finest type of British manhood and have been responsible for planting the Union Jack in the remotest parts of the world. They have done this, however, in a detached manner, never mingling with the native populations or getting to know them. The background of conquest has always been the wardroom, with its unbreakable traditions of the service, and the moment a savage tribe has been subdued, a cricket match has been organized to show the damned natives the type of people with whom they are dealing. Those Britons who have assimilated themselves to local conditions and made intimates of the inhabitants have been suspected of having gone native. Lady Hester Stanhope, who preceded Gertrude in a lesser degree in Arabia, adopted Eastern dress and became definitely Oriental in her way of thinking. Not so Gertrude, for, although she spoke the tribal dialects, could dine with a Bedouin or attend the banquet of an Arab king, and was known and respected all over Western Asia, she remained as fundamentally English as her brother-in-law of the Royal Navy. Her clothes came from London or Paris. She had her books sent out from Europe, and her parties at her Baghdad house were given with the same formality as they would have been in her home on the Yorkshire moors. Gertrude gave up her life to the Arab cause, and died for it, but when Admiral Richmond visited her, he found an Englishwoman who had retained all the dignity of her caste and treated the Arabs as her equals, because she felt that they were equal. Slowly, then, the kingdom of Iraq organized itself and settled down to a peaceful routine, which enabled Gertrude to have more leisure for her excavations and her duties as head of the museum. Intensive work had been restarted in Ur, reputed to be the birthplace of Abraham, but known to have existed thousands of years before, and in Kish. Kish, once the Versailles of Nebuchadnezzar, was even more ancient. Both places had been renowned for the Sumerian treasures dug up ever since archaeologists determined the sites of these two venerable cities. Gertrude had already done a great deal of work in Babylon, and with the aid of Professor Woolley, she now concentrated on Ur and Kish, and was able to unearth some superb potteries and seals for her Baghdad museum. But even this did not seem enough to satisfy her energy, and she turned her attention to fostering a project to create a Boy Scout unit in Iraq. By the beginning of 1925, there were 1,500 Iraqi scouts with their own native scoutmasters, and at the end of January they were able to give a display over which Gertrude presided. Besides the ordinary scout exercises, which were well carried out, a little patriotic atmosphere was introduced. The boys, dressed in the national colors, formed themselves into the flag of Iraq, and then into the map of their country, with ambitious boundaries far beyond those which at that time existed. At the end of the ceremony, they hoisted their flag on a tall standard, and forming a circle round it, turned towards Gertrude and cried loudly, "3 cheers for King Faisal!" At the end of March, the organic and electoral laws were passed, and the cabinet brought in and ratified 4 important measures. The dredging by the Anglo-Persian Oil Company of the mouth of the Tigris so that vessels of heavy draft could enter the port of Basra, a trade agreement with Syria, a concession for the development of the Mosul oil fields to an international group known as the Anglo-Turkish Petroleum Company, and lastly, the drawing up of long-term contracts with some 100 British advisors whose experience would help Iraq fit herself to become an independent member of the League of Nations. As an immediate consequence of these agreements, 2 British missions came out to Baghdad to examine the financial situation and the military organization of the country. The financial problems of Iraq were, to a large extent, taken over by British experts, while the military authorities adopted a scheme which would provide for a speedier training of the army so that it would shortly be able to take over the defense of the country unassisted by foreign troops. The elections were completed by the end of June with a most satisfactory representation, the political parties which had been constituted in former years having died a natural death through the actions of Gertrude and the High Commissioners. On July 16th, King Faisal opened Parliament in state, and with as little fuss as if Iraq had always been ruled by a representative assembly, the government set to work to construct, where destruction had always rather been the rule than the exception. In December, a new treaty between Great Britain and Iraq was submitted to Parliament and was passed almost unanimously. Now that all Gertrude had hoped for and worked for was realized, she suddenly felt very weary. During the 9 years she had been in the country, she had never relaxed, rising every day at 5:30 and taking exercise till 6, breakfasting at 6:40 on an egg and some fruit, and being in her office by 7. The innumerable things she had to do in the office are best summed up in her own words. The first thing I do in the office is to look through the 3 vernacular papers and translate anything that ought to be brought to the notice of the authorities. By the time I have done that, papers are beginning to come in, intelligence reports from all the Near East and India, local reports, petitions, etc. The petitions I usually dispose of myself. The local reports I note on, suggesting if necessary memoranda to the Ministers of Interior or Finance, or dispatches and letters. Sometimes I write a draft at once. Sometimes I propose the general outlines and wait for approval or correction. In and out of all this, people come in to see me, sheikhs and Arab officials, or just people who want to give some bit of information or ask for advice. If there's anything important in what they have to say, I inform the High Commissioner. At intervals in the daily routine, I'm now busy writing the annual report for the League of Nations. After a light lunch with one of her colleagues, she returned to her house and rested from 2:30 till 5. Then for a swim or a ride, or a long walk until supper at 7:30, after which more work until bedtime. And all this at the age of 56, when most women and many men have made up their minds that a time has come to relax and forget wearying routine. Neither could it be said that she was working for any great reward, for she knew that officially she could go no higher, and financially she was out of pocket. In 1925, she recorded that her yearly expenditure exceeded her salary by £650. But a moment came when she had to admit that even her human energy had limits of endurance. As long as she was concentrating all her energies on her mission, she did not notice how run down she was. But with the reaction, she realized that she was a sick woman. She accordingly decided to take a holiday and quite suddenly left Baghdad, arriving in London during August of 1925. End of chapter 17. Section 18 of Gertrude Bell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lynette Caulkins. Gertrude Bell by Ronald Bodley and Lorna Hearst. Chapter 18. When Gertrude reached home, her parents realized at once that she was in a bad state of health. They called in 2 specialists who said that she was suffering from mental and physical exhaustion due to overwork in a pernicious climate, and declared that unless she wanted to be an invalid for life, she must never return to Iraq. Gertrude was feeling so exhausted herself that at first she accepted the doctor's recommendations and consulted several friends as to what she could do to occupy her time in England. Even in her run-down condition, the thought of inactivity appalled her. It was suggested that she might stand for Parliament, and for a few days she thought the matter over. But it did not take long to put the notion out of her mind, and she wrote to the person who had made the suggestion, "No, I'm afraid you will never see me in the House. I have an invincible hatred of that kind of politics, and if you knew how little I should be fitted for it, you would not give it another thought. I have not, and I never have had, the quickness of thought and speech which could fit the clash of Parliament. I can do my own job in a way, and explain why I think that the right way of doing it, but I don't cover a wide enough field, and my natural desire is to slip back into the comfortable arena of archaeology and history, and to take only an onlooker's interest in the contest of actual affairs. I know that I could not enter the lists, apart from the fact that it would make me supremely miserable." She accordingly went up to Yorkshire, and the peaceful life in her garden and the pure air of the moors soon made her look and feel much better. She paid a visit to friends in Scotland, and seemed to be drifting back into the life for which she had been brought up. But by the time the leaves were beginning to fall, the relentless call of the East was gnawing at her again. Her parents did their utmost to persuade her to remain at home, but Gertrude gently and firmly explained that this would be impossible. Sir Hugh and Lady Bell listened patiently, trying to understand what Gertrude meant when she said that the East had wound itself round her heart until she did not know which was herself and which was it. It seemed so strange to hear this essentially English woman affirm that she was more a citizen of Baghdad than many of the Baghdadi born. The ecstasy in her eyes as she spoke of the loveliness of the Tigris and the palm trees along its banks, of the magnificence of the desert and the charm of the Arabs, seemed foreign to a woman born and bred in Yorkshire. "You see," she would say with emotion, "I lost the opportunity to make a home of my own a long time ago, and these people have taken the place of a family. They need me. They come to me for comfort and encouragement, and in their comfort I find my own. I feel limited in this country which you could never leave, and my whole being longs for that vast, merciless desert which must be my home until the end." The parents saw that there was no argument which would alter Gertrude's decision. They made the most of her remaining days in England, and at the end of October 1925 said good-bye to her as she set out on her last journey to the land of the Arabs. She, however, compromised to the extent of taking with her as a companion her first cousin, Sylvia Henley, the daughter of Lord Sheffield. Back in Baghdad, Gertrude was welcomed as though she had risen from the dead. She had hardly begun to unpack when streams of Iraqis were pouring into her garden. "Light of our eyes!" they cried. "Light of our eyes!" as they kissed her hands. And Gertrude felt grateful that she had had the strength to come back to the people who needed her. Almost immediately, King Faisal returned from the trip which he had made to Europe and arrived by plane. The cabinet and dignitaries of Baghdad, with the High Commissioner and his staff, were at the aerodrome to meet him. The king's plane appeared on the desert horizon, escorted by 9 smaller planes, and landed outside the oasis where the reception took place. It was all very formal and matter-of-fact, and no one seemed to regard it as miraculous or peculiar that the descendant of the prophet should alight on his kingdom from the air. Yet there were many present at that aerodrome who, 10 years earlier, would have fled at the sight of an airplane, supposing it to be a genie. Gertrude dropped her curtsy, and the king, as usual, made a point of singling her out from the people who were meeting him. The new year of 1926 was very unhappy for Gertrude, as her half-brother Hugo, to whom she was devoted, died in England of typhoid. She had but lately lost her uncle Lord Sheffield, to whom she was devoted, and Sylvia Henley had found the climate of Baghdad too much for her, and had been obliged to return to Europe. These losses seemed to crush Gertrude, and had an undoubted effect on her health, which, from now on, deteriorated. She had bouts of fever and sleepless nights interspersed with terrifying nightmares, during which all that she had been through in Iraq and Arabia came back in grotesque form. She gave herself no chance to recuperate, and continued her political duties as well as those connected with the museum. A spacious building had now been set aside to store Gertrude's finds, and she was kept busy planning the rooms and sorting out all that had been collected. When all was ready, the king opened the museum, and the following day the public was admitted. A curious public, which went to the museum because Gertrude had made it, but quite vague in their minds as to why the bits of pottery and old seals should be given a fine home and looked upon with such respect. From time immemorial, these remains of the past had been within the reach of every Arab beggar, and had been regarded as so many old stones. Mrs. Harold Nicholson came to stay with Gertrude, and was one of the last of her old friends to see her alive. Writing in her book, A Passenger to Tehran, she said, "Then a door in the blank wall, a jerky stop, a creaking of hinges, a broadly smiling servant, a rush of dogs, a vision of the garden path edged with carnations in pots, a little low house at the end of the path, an English voice, Gertrude Bell." Then she was back in her chair pouring out information. The state of Iraq, the excavations at Ur, the need for a bigger museum, what new books had come out, what was happening in England. The doctors had told her she ought not to go through another summer in Baghdad, but what could she do in England, eating out her heart for Iraq? Next year, perhaps. But I couldn't say she looked ill, could I? I could, and did. She laughed and brushed that aside. She was a wonderful hostess, and I felt that her personality held together and made a center for all those exiled Englishmen whose other common bond was their service of Iraq. They all seemed to be instilled by the same spirit of constructive enthusiasm, but I could not help feeling that their mission there would have been more in a nature of drudgery than of zeal, but for the radiant ardor of Gertrude Bell. Whatever subject she touched, she lit up. Such vitality was irresistible. We laid plans, alas, for when I should return to Baghdad in the autumn. We would go to Babylon. We would go to Ctesiphon. She would have got her new museum by then. When she went back to England, if indeed she was compelled to go, she would write another book. So we sat talking, as friends talk who have not seen one another for a long time, until the shadows lengthened, and she said it was time to go and see the king. As if fate had decided that something more must be done to wear out the stubborn vitality of this obstinate Englishwoman, Gertrude suddenly had another onerous duty thrown upon her shoulders. Terrific rains caused the Tigris to overflow its banks, bringing disaster to all the neighboring country. The government immediately called on Gertrude, and she found herself serving on the Committee of Relief for the flood sufferers, and, as usual, having to do practically everything in this connection. But she treated it as being all in the day's work, and merely commented, "I also find it boring, for all the desert where I used to ride and walk is a lake, and Ark and all the rest become quite comprehensible when one sees Mesopotamia in flood time." And so her work continued throughout the torrid summer in Baghdad. Gertrude's letters did not indicate to her parents that she was feeling ill, but there was a certain note of weariness underlying the usual enthusiastic accounts of what was going on. The last great event in the development of the destinies of Iraq, which seemed to predict an era of permanent peace, was the signing of the tripartite treaty between Great Britain, Turkey, and Iraq. The treaty was ratified by the two chambers of the Iraq Parliament on June 14, 1926, and on June 25th, the king gave a banquet to celebrate the event. Gertrude was one of the principal guests at the party and appeared radiantly happy at the fulfillment of her hopes and dreams. Her belief in Faisal and the Arab people had been justified. Her perseverance had been rewarded. This was the last state function which she attended. She was not actually ill, but she wanted to be alone and remained more and more among the rose trees of her garden, which spread mantles of rioting color over the walls. The scents of the flowers seemed to soothe her, and carried her back to another rose-dressed house in the east, where she had first listened to a dear, long-dead voice which had opened her mind to the treasures of the Orient. The voice seemed nearer now, and she waited almost impatiently for the time, which she knew was fast approaching, when she could go to the refuge of those loving arms. On the morning of July 12th, she did not get up at her usual early hour, and an unaccustomed silence brooded over her home. When her servants became worried and went into her room to see if their mistress was unwell, they found her dead. That vital flame, which nothing had ever quenched, had flickered out as she passed peacefully away in her sleep. Gertrude's death caused widespread sorrow throughout the United Kingdom and Britain's empire beyond the seas. To the general public, she had become a legendary personality. To the government, one of those servants of the state who could not be replaced. To her family, the daughter who, while giving her life to her country, never for one day forgot home. From all over England and her dominions came letters and telegrams of sympathy. No particular class was represented by the mourners. Ministers of state, men of letters, archaeologists, soldiers and sailors, villagers of the North Country, grieved that they had lost Gertrude Bell. The colonial secretary spoke of Gertrude's death and her work for Britain before a crowded and silent House of Commons. George V of England wrote to Gertrude's parents, "The Queen and I are grieved to hear of the death of your distinguished daughter, whom we held in high regard. The nation will mourn with us the loss of one who, by her intellectual powers, force of character, and personal courage, rendered important, and what I trust will prove lasting benefit to the country, and to those regions where she worked with such devotion and self-sacrifice. We truly sympathize with you in your sorrow. George, Rex Imperator." In the Arab countries there was grief and consternation. Gertrude was idolized in the minds of the desert people as someone above all others, a creature who could not die, a person without whom they felt that life would no longer be the same. Letters from all parts of Arabia, Syria, Palestine, and Iraq, on all kinds of paper, in all manner of calligraphy, flooded the offices of the High Commissioner. The highest and lowest tried to express their grief and convey their gratitude for all that Gertrude had done for them. Some of the letters were veritable poems, some just incoherent words of sorrow. There were so many that their publication would have filled a book. One of the most touching of these missives came from old Haji Naji, in whose garden Gertrude had so often rested from her work. There were just 2 lines. "It was my faith always to send to Miss Bell the first of my fruits and vegetables, and I know not now where I shall send them." Gertrude's funeral ceremony was a magnificent apotheosis to her life. A torrid day had ended with one of those golden evenings of the desert. A warm breeze rustled through the tall palm trees of the oasis and ruffled the sluggish waters of the Tigris. Placed in a plain wooden coffin, Gertrude's body moved slowly through the silent streets of Baghdad which were thronged with robed figures who made no attempt to conceal their feelings. Along the route, over which Gertrude had so often walked and ridden, the troops of the Iraq army rested on arms reversed as the long procession passed. The High Commissioner and Prime Minister followed the hearse as chief mourners, and behind them all the members of the Iraq cabinet and the British civil, military, and Air Force staffs. The full-dress uniforms of the Englishmen glistened white in the sunset and contrasted with the bronzed faces which had lost their proverbial British imperturbability. Close on the heels of the officials came a host of tall, dark-skinned men in flowing garments, their turbans bound about with strands of black camel hair interwoven with threads of silver and gold. The sheikhs of Arabia had come to pay their last tribute to the woman with whom they had wandered about the desert and for whom not one would have hesitated to give his life. Proudly and silently they strode, but, like their British companions, their faces had lost that haughty indifference of men with great lineage. From the gates of the cemetery the coffin was borne to the graveside by those young men of the High Commissioner's staff who had worked with Gertrude, and to whom her home had been a haven of rest in the midst of a strange and often hostile people. The coffin was draped in the Union Jack, on which rested Gertrude's many orders and decorations. Before the words of commitment, Sir Henry Dobbs stepped forward. His eyes were strained as he looked about him, at the Englishmen in their uniforms, and the Arabs in their robes. Speaking clearly, but without the formal authority of his usual speeches, he said, "For the last 10 years of her life, Gertrude Bell concentrated all the indomitable fervor of her spirit and all the astounding gifts of her mind to the service of the Arab cause, and especially to Iraq. At last her body, always frail, was broken by the energy of her soul. Her bones rest where she had wished them to rest, in the soil of Iraq. Her friends are left desolate." The High Commissioner saluted the coffin and stepped back. "Man, that is born of a woman, hath but a short time to live, and is full of misery. He fleeth as it were a shadow, and never continueth in one stay. In the midst of life we are in death, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, in sure and certain hope of the resurrection." The firing party raised their rifles. There was a sharp word of command, and the 3 volleys crackled out in the still air. The sad, heartrending notes of the last post swelled up and died away. After a pause, the buglers once more placed the bugles to their lips, and hopefully the reveille went echoing through the oasis. As the people turned sadly away, the sun dipped in flaming orange behind the wastes of the desert and sent a shaft of emerald-green light into the sky. The breeze freshened and went whispering through the feathery palm trees as they gracefully bowed to one whom they had watched over for so many years. The palm trees of the neighboring oasis took up the message and passed it on until the rustling died softly in another oasis hundreds of miles away beside the grave of a young man to whose memory a very noble lady had remained faithful for over 30 years. So Gertrude sleeps on the rising ground outside Baghdad. At her feet the Tigris rolls sluggishly along, and away the desert stretches out in its barren immensity. A simple white stone with the name in English and in Arabic marks the grave. In Baghdad, the principal wing of the museum bears Gertrude's name, this last token to her memory being at the immediate request of King Faisal. A brass plaque in the wall states, "Gertrude Bell, whose memory the Arabs will ever hold in reverence and affection, created this museum in 1923. King Faisal and the government of Iraq, in gratitude for her great deeds in this country, have ordered that the principal wing shall bear her name." It was spring on the Yorkshire moors. The mauve and green of the heather had the freshness of rebirth under golden rays of the setting sun. A black cock called as he scanned the sky for a late hunting hawk. A cock grouse strutted importantly before the chicks, which boldly ventured from beneath the wings of their anxious mother. A dog fox waited hungrily until man and hound had observed that curious ritual of retiring to bed when the hunting was at its best. The world tipped quickly up, caressing the flaming disk of the sun, and took it to herself. The afterglow died and the twilight came, accentuating the whiteness of the moorland road, along which a man came striding as one accustomed to long marches. He wore the khaki uniform of a British soldier, and on his chest the ribbons commemorating wars in distant parts contrasted with the drabness of his tunic. As the soldier reached the crest of the road, he paused and turned towards the west. He had not seen a sunset over these wild moors for years, and he remained, feasting his eyes on the greens and the purples and the browns as they gradually faded with the oncoming darkness. He had purposely walked from the station so that he could relish alone this scene which he had so often conjured up in his mind during his service in the East. The spring night rushed on, extinguishing the colors until the countryside became a great, rolling, hueless expanse. It suddenly reminded the watcher of the desert, and carried his mind back to days long ago when he used to sit with his father outside the moorland cottage and hear of the strange lands where the flag of England had led him. In those days, the acres over which Mr. Bell's gamekeeper watched had seemed to the boy the vastest territory he could visualize. He smiled now as the memories of the immensity of the desert floated before his mind. It was quite dark when the soldier resumed his trudge. The wind rose and whispered through the heather and stirred up little clouds of dust on the road. Down there he could see twinkling lights which beckoned a welcome. Coming home made his periods of exile worth while, but this time he had a sacred mission to perform before he crossed the threshold of his mother's cottage. After a while, the moorland gave way to a few straggling houses, and then to a church. An evening service was coming to an end, and the stained glass windows stood out blue and red against the night. The soldier waited until the bulk of the congregation had disappeared, and, entering the church, he avoided the main aisle and made his way up the side, looking for something. He ignored the verger, who was putting out the lights, and attentively examined each window in turn. Finally, he stopped before a lovely piece of glass. His eyes drank in the soft colors and then rested on an inscription in Persian. He could not decipher the characters, but they gave him a happy sense of familiarity, and he stared at them affectionately before turning to the English translation. Thus said the poet, "When death comes to you, all ye whose life sand through the hourglass slips, he lays 2 fingers on your ears, and 2 upon your eyes he lays, 1 on your lips, whispering silence." Footnote: This is Gertrude's English adaptation from one of her favorite Persian poems, and is carved round her memorial window in the village church of her home in Yorkshire. End footnote. And then, below the verse, his eyes came to more words. To the memory of Gertrude Bell. The soldier automatically came to attention. Then, fumbling in his tunic, he took out an envelope which he carefully opened. A dried and faded Persian rose lay in his hands, which he gently smoothed and reverently laid on the sill of the window. For another minute he remained reading the inscription, then turned and walked slowly through the darkened church. And as he went, he seemed to feel a host of robed figures crowding about him and filling the church with all the scents of the East. Out on the moors, all was quiet. The only signs of life were the lights of the Yorkshire iron foundries flickering in the distance like the fires of Arab camps in the desert. End of chapter 18. End of part 4, The Birth of Iraq. End of Gertrude Bell by Ronald Bodley and Lorna Hearst.